Good afternoon, everyone. In this lecture, we'll finish the book of Job by reading chapters 24, 30, 32, 38, and from chapter 40 to 42, which is the end of the book of Job. Since we are completing the second book for the entire course of Comparative Philosophy with Death and Dying, I'm hoping to keep this lecture short and sweet, or trying to avoid sounding like one of the characters from this story. So let's see if I can finish this lecture earlier than the usual. The chapter 24 of the book of Job refers to Job's response to Eliphaz's talk in the beginning of the third cycle of the dialogue between Job and his friends. And then chapter 30, Job enters this long monologue. This shows that the ways in which the third cycle ended provides the space in which Job had no choice but to just talk to himself. And in the third section, we will see how God enters the dialogue between Job and his friends, and also the epilogue where we actually get the results of these discussions about the retribution principle and the suffering that Job is actually going through. So we will see the resolution to the philosophical conundrum that we went through in this book. And then, as usual, we will end with some questions that you might be able to use for your journal entries or maybe become part of your final paper. Okay, the third cycle, chapter 24. Again, this is Job's response to Eliphaz's third speech. Basic argument that Job gives is that the justice is slow. He complains how retribution principle is not true because if you look around the world, you see injustice thriving. The wicked lives. So let's take a look at the passage from the scripture. Job 24, verse 1. Why are times not kept by the Almighty, and why do those who know Him never see His days? The wicked remove landmarks, they seize flocks and pasture them. So you see this ancient crime of moving the boundaries of landmarks, right? So you almost invading other people's territories and moving the boundaries between your own and their property, right? So you see this sort of invasion of the territories by the wicked. They drive away the donkey of the orphan, they take the widow's ox for a pledge, they thrust the needy off the road, the poor of the earth all hide themselves. Like wild asses in the desert, they go out to their toil. Scavenging in the wasteland food for their young, they reap in a field not their own, and they glean in the vineyard of the wicked. They lie all night naked without clothing, for he will complete what he appoints for me. They are wet with the rain of the mountains and cling to the rock for want of shelter. So you see the wicked. It's oppression of the poor and helpless. So this is how evil thrives in the world. Injustice actually makes more profit in this world. By oppressing the poor, the oppressor becomes richer and wealthier. Verse 9, there are those who snatch the orphan child from the breast and take as a pledge the infant of the poor. They go about naked without clothing. Though hungry, they carry the sheaves between their terraces and they press out oil. They tread the wine presses but suffer thirst. From the city the dying groan and the throat of the wounded cries for help, yet God pays no attention to their prayer. So why is it that there's injustice in the world and how the wicked prospers? By oppressing the weak and helpless. So you see in verse 2, the removing the landmarks, and then the oppression of the poor in verse 5 onwards. And then verse 12 basically argues that God is not on the side of the weak and the oppressed. It seems justice is not swiftly served in this world at all. Look around. There's so many violence and injustice and wickedness prospering in this world. This is a great expression, verse 17. For deep darkness is mourning to all of them, for they are friends with the terrors of deep darkness. So the wicked are the friends with the terrors of deep darkness. This is verse 21, end of the chapter 24. They harm the childless woman and do no good to the widow, yet God prolongs the life of the mighty by His power. They rise up when they despair of life. He gives them security and they are supported. His eyes are upon their ways. They are exalted a little while and then are gone. So you see how Job provides this counter-argument to the retribution principle. But in the process of doing that, as he observes the world in which the injustice and wicked thrive more than justice and the poor, he comes to not only question the retribution principle, but counter-argument to the retribution principle leads him to conclude that maybe divine justice is in question. So that his attention shifts from the ways in which the world is set up, but also the ways in which God set up the world. Right? So he started to actually question the justice of the divine creator at the end of chapter 24 as a response to Eliphaz's third argument. So he says in verse 12, but God charges no one with wrongdoing. So he's not listening to the poor and oppressed. And then at the end of chapter 24, he says, if it is not so, who will prove me a liar and show that there is nothing in what I say? So who can prove me false at the end of chapter 24? He's providing a really good argument here, right? And in fact, you can see how his friends are incapable of responding to his point. He has a really good point. He provides enough evidences to counter-argue the retribution principle. And by the fact that we can disprove the retribution principle seems to insinuate that divine justice is up to question. At least the justice of the divine absolute is questionable. In response to this Job's argument, you have Bildad's third speech, which is very short. There are only 6 verses, so he repeats the same point, but you can almost feel that he's just not into this discussion anymore. He doesn't really know how to disprove what Job is talking about. And then you notice how Zophar disappears from this discussion. Remember that Zophar is the one who is much more relentless in pursuing the retribution principle. Also, he argues how Job should be wicked because he's going through the suffering. Zophar gives up this conversation whatsoever, and you see the structure of the third cycle sort of crumbles. There's a collapse of the communication among the Job and his friends. So they're constructive arguments about the ways in which we can understand the Job's life, what he's going through in his life, and also the ways in which we can understand the world. They're falling apart. So 2 worldviews, right? One person going through the suffering as the righteous, see the suffering in the world, takes one position, and the other ones who believe to be just and doing everything they can in their power to be righteous, see the benefit of the retribution principle. And then these 2 worldviews, at the end of the 3 cycles of conversations, falls apart. And then Zophar can even start his conversation. So again, this is the image of an impasse between Job and his friends. So instead of Zophar's response to Job's speech in chapter 24, Job enters his own monologue. Then let's jump to Job 30. Once again, it's important for you to skim through the parts that you're not assigned to read, so I will highlight some of the things that are relevant to the chapter 30. Also, remember I mentioned once that the monologue or soliloquy in ancient and medieval philosophical tradition has an important role. So sometimes when you try to understand the metaphysical principle or the principle by which the things are what they are, so that, the divine absolute or divine principle of creation in Judeo-Christian tradition is often described as something we can access through self-examination or monologue. Of course, you have to conduct a dialogue to understand the world and ourselves, but in the process of doing it, you have to move from the exterior to the interior, which is to conduct a monologue or self-examination, and through that, you can actually reach the divine transcendence. So this is again the classical theme of moving from the conversation with the friends internally to a dialogue with himself, so he can rise to the occasion where he can have a conversation with God. Okay, Job 27. The beginning of Job 27 is important. Job again took up his discourse and said, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak falsehood, and my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Until I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach me for any of my days." So he said, I'm going to maintain my integrity. That's chapter 27. At 28, verse 12, "But where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Mortals do not know the way to it, and it is not found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me, and the sea says, it is not with me. It cannot be gotten for gold, and silver cannot be weighed out as its price," so on and so forth. And then verse 20, "Where then does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? It is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air." And verse 23, "God understands the way to it and he knows its place." So Job, like his friends, reserved the divine transcendence. The divine understanding or divine wisdom is something higher than what we can actually achieve through human intelligence, and they cannot be bought through properties. So all these ulterior motives or any external goods cannot help us reach wisdom. So integrity is something that you can keep it to yourself, something that you can cultivate by yourself, but it's not something that you can buy or something that is exchangeable with external goods. Okay, that's chapter 28. In chapter 29, he actually argues that he was the retribution principle incarnate. So the verse 1 to verse 11, you see how the noble class or how society responded to Job's presence with utmost respect. Why they responded to him with the respect and honor? Because, he says, verse 12, I delivered the poor who cried, and the orphan who had no helper. The blessing of the wretched came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and he clothed me. My justice was like robe and turban. It was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. I was father to the needy. And I championed the cause of the stranger. I broke the fangs of the unrighteous and made them drop their prey from their teeth. So I was the champion, protector, the guardian of the city of Uruk. If the city of the Uruk is the city of the oppressed, right? I'm the one who made sure that justice is served. And I was the one who helped the poor and oppressed. Then I thought I shall die in my nest, and I shall multiply my days like the phoenix. And then let's jump to verse 24. I smiled on them when they had no confidence, and the light of my countenance they did not extinguish. So I encouraged the poor and oppressed to feel confident, to feel encouraged to live a better life. And I even financed them to live a better life. I said in the beginning of these lectures on Book of Job, and Job before the suffering is somebody that you would like to have as your boss at the big company, right? Verse 25, I chose their way and sat as chief, and I lived like a king among his troops, like one who comforts mourners. So I was the king in the society and respected by people. Now we enter Job chapter 30. He says, basically, I became object of the mockery, he says. Those who mock him are animals. This is basically the message of the chapter 30. But now they make sport of me, those who are younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to set with the dogs on my flock. What could I gain from the strength of their hands? All their vigor is gone. Through want and hard hunger, they gnaw the dry and desolate ground, they pick mallow and the leaves of bushes, and to warm themselves they are driven out from society. People shout after them as after a thief, and move on. And verse 9. And now they mock me in song, I am a byword to them. They abhor me, they keep aloof from me, they do not hesitate to spit at the sight of me. So I became something much lower than where I was. Again, this is a repetition of something that he talked about earlier, but you have a more vivid image of what it was like for him to live in a society with success, and then what it is like for him to live his life right now with these sufferings. Verse 15, terrors are turned upon me, my honor is pursued as by the wind, and my prosperity has passed away like a cloud. My past glory is all gone. And now my soul is poured out within me, days of affliction have taken hold of me. The night racks my bones, and the pain that gnaws me takes no rest. With violence he seized my garment, he grasped me by the collar of my tunic. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cried to you, and you did not answer me. I stand, and you merely look at me. You have turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecuted me. You lifted me up on the wind, and you make me ride on it, and you toss me about in the roar of the storm. I know that you will bring me to death and to the house appointed for all living. So he basically argues that God turned cruel to me, right? And you persecute me. Remember the legal language that they use, that I'm going to defend myself in this court of divine law? And then the prosecutor here, Job argues, is God, who is coming after me. And of course, it's allusion to his friends. His friends are accusing him for iniquity. Also, let's look at this expression in verse 11, chapter 30. Because God has loosened my bowstring and humbled me, they have cast off restraint in my presence. So you have this image of bowstring loosened. In another version, it says, now that God has unstrung my bow and afflicted me, they throw off restraint. That's another version. So this image of bowstring is the image of vigorousness or life force in human existence. So if you have a really tight, well-strung bow, you'll be able to actually shoot the arrow, right? So you have this image of vigor or life force that human beings actually have. But also it's weapon, right? So he was described as the king who commands the troops in chapter 29. So you have this image of broken bow. That's the image of Job at the end of his suffering. I became something like unstrung by God, and God tests me to this position. In fact, he prosecutes me to go through this suffering. This image of bow happens quite often in the biblical tradition. So it's very important for you to know this image. And then Job 31. Again, you're not assigned to read this. but skim through it if you can. Job argues that I'm innocent. After final oath of innocent, he argues that I'm not responsible for any iniquities in society. This is verse 35, chapter 31. "Oh, that I had one to hear me, here's my signature, let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had this indictment written by my adversary." So you see, again, the legal language to prove or make an oath of innocence in chapter 31. At this point, you should see how the question of his wife that disappeared from this conversation a long time ago started to make sense. Why does he curse God and die or become free of suffering? If he admits that he has committed some iniquity, or maybe he cursed God and then confessed his iniquity that I cursed God, and then he will become free of suffering by dying, or passively, as like some of the friends argue, that he might be able to receive prosperity. What's the problem with this picture? It just seems a very reasonable option at this point, right? I mean, look around the world. The world is set up in such a way that injustice actually outlives the justice. The wicked wins over the innocent. Innocent and poor are always oppressed. So in order for you to become free of suffering, retribution principle or his friends basically argue that just confess your sin. To that proposal, what Job would have to do to end evil suffering is to fabricate his sins. I didn't commit any iniquities, or I didn't commit any crimes, but if I said that I did and confess, I should be able to become free of suffering. What's the problem with this approach? Of course, what Job is actually thinking here is that if I fabricate sins and then confess it and become free of suffering, possibly receive prosperity, in that case, he's basically agreeing that the retribution principle is right, and also the devil's point is correct. Remember, the devil's argument is that the people maintain their integrity because they can receive these exterior goods. Their motivations are tainted for gaining these prosperity in this life. So if you take away this prosperity, take away their health, they would easily spit to your face. That's his argument. Now, if Job fabricates sins and then confess it so that he can actually regain his prosperity and become free of suffering, the devil's point is right. His integrity is actually made for the sake of external goods. So he's stuck in this position that he wants to be free of suffering, but in order for him to do that, he would have to fabricate sins. In that case, he's no longer consistent in arguing that retribution principle is wrong, or that the Satan's point becomes true. Okay. And then suddenly, this character, Elihu, joins the conversation out of nowhere. So let's look at how he appears in chapter 32 and how that speech plays a role in relation to the whole book in the following. So this is chapter 32, verse 1. So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. So these friends, old friends, wise men, came from afar, first sat with compassion toward Job, and 7 days, 7 nights, then trying to understand the situation, they couldn't. Then Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, became angry. He was angry at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He was angry also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, though they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. But when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he became angry. Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered, I am young in years and you are aged. I'm young and you're old. That's the first thing he says, right? He wasn't even part of the conversation. Suddenly he just appears and says, I'm young, you're old, let me speak. And he's just angry at these old people having this conversation and not coming to the right conclusion. He's described as young, very angry, very disrespectful, right? Just first thing you said, you're old, I'm young, let me tell you what I think. And then also he's very wordy. How long does he talk? How many chapters do I have to skip for this class? He actually talks for 6 chapters. We exhausted all the words to describe the enormous suffering of Job, and suddenly this young man who doesn't clearly understand what's going on spends 6 chapters to talk about this, or at least trying to express his thoughts on this issue, right? Do you remember this image of the east wind? This is precisely the picture of Elihu. He is full of hot air. You know, sometimes the example that I can think of, you're a philosophy student, so you take some philosophy classes or big philosophy classes, Or you go to philosophy conferences and then you're listening to this famous professor giving a very sophisticated argument about some really important issues, and the discussion going back and forth, and it just heated debate and a really interesting thing. And then suddenly one student raised his or her hand and then asked a question, and it's a really long question, right? Or long opinions about something that are remotely related to the topic that we're discussing. And it goes on and on and on. I don't know if you have ever experienced this in your class or in conferences. This is quite common in philosophy events. One person, sometimes more than one person, asks a question and just really long speech, and it feels like eternity, right? It just goes on. And I'm hoping that this lecture wouldn't become like Elihu's speech. I tend to talk a little too long for these lectures, so I want to keep it short. Let's see if I can get out of this. Or maybe that's a sign that I'm actually young, so that's great, right? We shall see. Anyway, Elihu keeps talking about his thoughts on this issue, and pay attention to the ways he describes his points. He's quite rude. Let's keep reading from the verse 6. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak and many years teach wisdom. But surely it is the Spirit in the mortal, the breath of the Almighty, that makes for understanding. It is not the old that are wise, nor the aged that understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me. Let me also declare my opinion. The divine element of the Almighty is in every single person's soul, he argues. So understanding resides in every human being. Therefore, everyone has a right to say something, which is correct. But then argument doesn't really lead to the conclusion, therefore. Remember I said in some of the comments to your journal entries that when you use the word like therefore, all the preceding sentences would have to construct the argument to reach the conclusion therefore. There's no connection between what he says before therefore and after therefore. And he said, therefore I say, listen to me, let me also declare my opinion. This is verse 10. Now, this is a very important phrase, opinion. I was afraid to tell you my opinion, but now listen to me, I'll declare my opinion. Opinion is worthless in philosophy classes, especially for philosophical argument, like the questions that ask the meaning of life, for instance. Opinion is worthless. Why? We have this classical distinction since the time of ancient philosophy. The distinction is philosophy and sophistry. So philosophy is about knowledge, truth, what is right, what is wrong. Sophistry is to make things look right or wrong, to dictate the ways in which people think. So instead of arguing for what is right and wrong, regardless of the people's opinions about them, sophistry pays attention to the ways in which people opine. So the distinction in, for instance, in Plato's dialogues is philosophy is about is not. Sophistry is about seems to be and seems not to be, okay? And also philosophy is about truth and knowledge, and sophistry is about appearance and opinions. So you have ancient classical distinctions already starting in the book of Job. You see how Elihu comes in and says, let me tell you my opinion. But again, opinion is worthless. Why worthless? Because opinion is all subjective. Everyone is entitled to have one. You have this opinion about political issues or opinions about aesthetic questions. To me, in my opinion, it looks beautiful. Or to me, in my opinion, this looks right. To me, in my opinion, this looks wrong. But now the question in philosophy is whether or not we can objectively state that thing is beautiful, objectively state whether or not this argument is or is not correct. So, as I said in philosophy essays, you want to avoid using the word like, in my opinion, or it seems to be, or it seems not to be. You can use these subjective format to set up an argument. It seems to me, or it seems that the retribution principle is correct. However, I argue that the retribution principle isn't correct. So the final statement has to be devoid of opinion, but you can actually set up the whole argument by saying, it seems to be the case, it seems that A is the case, but I argue that A isn't the case. Okay? That is acceptable. But you can't use seems in the concluding sentences like, therefore I say, listen to me, this seems to be the case. You can't really do that in philosophy, okay? So chapter 32, verse 12, I gave you my attention, but there was in fact no one that confuted Job, no one among you that answered his words. So nobody answered Job. So I'm angry about this. Right? And verse 18, For I am full of words, the spirit within me constrains me, my heart is indeed like wine that has no vent, like a new wineskins it is ready to burst. I must speak so that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. I will not show partiality to any person or use flattery toward anyone, for I do not know how to flatter, or my maker would soon put an end to me. So he goes on and on. There's no substance to his argument. He's just full of words. And then chapter 33, 31, pay heed, Job, listen to me. Be silent, I will speak. In fact, everybody is silent, but he's just probably trying to stop them from stopping him, right? Verse 33, if not, listen to me, be silent, I will teach you wisdom. End of chapter 34, those who have sense will say to me, this is verse 34, and the wise who hear me will say, Job speaks without knowledge, his words are without insight. Would that Job were tried to the limit, because his answers are those of the wicked, for he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. So he cites the retribution principle here. Chapter 36, Elihu continued and said, bear with me a little, and I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf. If you say, bear with me a little, that means like everyone is just really, could you just please stop talking? Like your question is so long, we want to move on and actually listen to this famous professor saying something really important. Why do I have to listen to your strange question? So bear with me a little. That's a bad sign. And also he says, on behalf of God, I will speak. So at this point, Elihu actually represents God, right? On behalf of God, I would like to speak. So you have this image of hubris taking place with this young man's speech against Job at this point. Chapter 37, he's still talking, right? And then verse 14, hear this, O Job, stop and consider the wondrous works of God. This guy is unbelievable. He just doesn't stop talking. And then chapter 38 starts with God's speech. The person in question comes forward and talk. And again, I'm continuing with this example of the philosophy conference. This famous professor is giving a talk and somebody we don't really know asking these questions that are not related to the presentation. The famous professor's response is not to deal with that question. It's actually a little bit mean, right? Like oh, thank you for your question. That's really interesting, but it's not quite related to my position. So let me talk about something more relevant to the theme of the conference and just kind of ease the response. God's response is basically ignore Elihu and let's just talk about Job and his friends. And in fact, God talks directly to Job. How does he talk? He talks through whirlwind. This is very important because he's communicating to Job directly, not through dream or vision as Elihu discussed in chapter 33. Elihu said usually divine wisdom is communicated through us through dream and vision. This is precisely the way the Epic of Gilgamesh talked about communication between divine and human sometimes, right? Sometimes Enkidu have this dream or Gilgamesh has this dream. Dream played an important role. But notice how Job is living the nightmare. He's just wide awake and he's seeing this nightmare. And then divine word comes from whirlwind. Remember the image of the storm that Job described it as causing his pain? Now that storm is giving him a resolution to the issue that he's facing at the moment. So how does God respond to Job's questions? Why am I suffering? Why am I going through these miseries? Regardless of the fact that I am righteous and innocent, there's nothing to confess. There's nothing wrong with what I have done. Why am I going through this? Interestingly, the form in which God answers Job's question is a rhetorical question. In fact, there are more than 70 rhetorical questions in God's response to Job. What does this imply? Remember, rhetorical question is often deconstructive. So constructive argument is, what is A? A is this. Rhetorical question is ask the question, what is A, in such a way that the answer is obvious. It denies the possibility of asking that question or the questioner, right? So you can see how this series of rhetorical questions from God disqualifies Job from asking the question that he did. So that is to say, God doesn't provide any answer to Job whatsoever. No answer whatsoever to Job. I asked these questions and God basically argues that who are you to ask these questions? Are you in a position to be able to even ask these questions? And as we will see later, at the end of this conversation between Job and God, you see how God concludes that the retribution principle is wrong. So friends are wrong and a retribution principle should be denied. Okay. And then he talks about this behemoth and leviathan, mythological creatures that are symbolize destruction and uncontrolled chaos. They are even subordinate to the divine absolute. So you have this William Blake's famous sketch of God telling Job that even these are under my command. So what are you to ask these questions? And then at the end of this conversation between God and Job, Job concludes, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So he's actually satisfied with no answer to the question that he asked. This is quite troubling for many readers in contemporary time. And I'm pretty sure it was troubling for many people in the past as well. Why is it troubling? Before answering that question, let's take a look at this passage from chapter 38, which is really interesting. This is chapter 38, verse 17. Let's read from 16. Have you entered into the spring of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? So he talks about, do you know how the creation or the universe works? Because I'm in charge of the universe. Do you even know how the universe functions? And he said, verse 17, have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this. So what do you know about death? Remember the Job said, I really hope to die because living is worse than dying. Here, God comes in and says, what do you know about death? You know nothing about that. So it's very dismissive. It's very push the notion of death something more than just comfortable sleep or peaceful end to all the inequality that we suffer from in this life. He said, what do you know about death? You're not even in a position to be able to understand that concept. Talks about the Pleiades and Orion, right? Mazzaroth and Bear, how the constellation is controlled by me. And then verse 36, who has put wisdom in inward parts or given understanding to the mind? So God declares that the ways in which the world is constructed is by me, but also the ways in which you understand the world is also created by me. So God is the foundation of both world and human understanding. So both soul and the universe are created by the divine absolute or divine principle. Therefore, I'm the one in charge of your understanding. The questions that you ask is made possible by me. So how could you possibly ask these questions to the foundation for the possibility of asking these questions? Right? Very philosophical, deconstructive argument toward these existential questions. Whether or not these responses are satisfactory, but that's very interesting, the answer given from the divine transcendence. He talks about animals in chapter 39, and then chapter 40, there's a short response by Job. Chapter 40, verse 1, and the Lord said to Job, shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? Anyone who argues with God must respond. Then Job answered the Lord, see, I'm of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer twice, but will proceed no farther. So he is basically satisfied. And then verse 8, will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be justified? Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like this? So he puts Job in finite human realm and then presents himself as infinite capacity to order the world and human understanding. And then chapter 45, he goes on to talk about Leviathan. What kind of symbolism is this? You can talk about this in your journal. Interestingly, verse 25, when Leviathan raises itself up, the gods are afraid at the crushing they are besides themselves. So it's almost like the image of deluge from the Epic of Gilgamesh. On earth, he has no equal, a creature without fear. He surveys everything that is lofty. It is king over all that are proud. This is the end of chapter 41. And then chapter 42, verse 5 and 6, I heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you, therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. So Job is ultimately satisfied with this answer. Well, I would have to ask you a question. Why do you think he's actually satisfied? Then let's look at the prologue, because it seems to provide resolution to the whole problem. Of course, we have to put a question mark there. So let's look at the prologue. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So you have not spoken truth about me as my servant Job has. Multiple implications. First of all, he's saying retribution principle should be denied, period. So retribution principle does not hold. That's objectifiable statement from the divine transcendence that doesn't opine. They just tell you what is true. And then he talks to Eliphaz because Eliphaz is the leading speaker. He's the basis in which all the other speakers develop their argument. And if you remember correctly, a lot of things that friends said and the things that God said about himself, they're quite similar. They talk about divine transcendence. Job is not in a position to be able to understand what God thinks. Why is it that God can tell these friends who said this almost the same thing that you're not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job has? And interestingly, Job's argument of divine transcendence and friends' argument of divine transcendence are pretty much the same, but they reach different conclusions. Remember? When Bildad and Zophar argues that humans are worthless, Job argues that divine transcendence is so high that we cannot have comprehensive understanding of the world, but he doesn't make humans worthless. So there's a conundrum of the similarity between Job's friend's argument and God's description of divine attributes. They seem to be quite similar, but why is it that God can say to the friends that you're wrong? Okay, let's read on. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer up for yourself a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has done. So here you see the retribution principle is literally denied. If the retribution principle is right, these friends should be punished, and then Job rewarded. But he said, as long as Job mitigates these prayers, and if you, friends, apologize, repent, and give these offering, and if Job prays for you, there's a reconciliation between you and me. So there's no retribution principle here. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. So there's a restoration between Job and his friends and God. And then God restores the fortune. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much he had before. Then there came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a gold ring. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys, which are twice as much as he used to have before the suffering. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters, just like before. And skip one verse. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. So equality between daughters and brothers, right? And they were really beautiful. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and his children's children, 4 generations, and Job died old and full of days. At the end of the book of Job, what you see is that not only the reconciliation between friends and God, but also friendship and family relations and social standing, all of them are restored. But keep in mind, all of these things are mediated through Job's prayer. And at the end of the book, you see happily ever after, and he dies, right? So that's the chapter 42, verse 12 to 17. Then you go, what the heck is going on? I think the story makes sense to us if it ended at the end of chapter 42, or maybe at the end of verse 6 of chapter 42, Job repented in dust and ashes. Great image. Let's end there. He might die after this. We don't know, but that's the end of the story. Or God tells friends that you're wrong, Job is right, and as long as you make these offerings and Job prays, you're forgiven. Retribution principle denied. There's reconciliation among friends, Job, and God, right? That's a great ending of the story. Now, the troubling factor starts from verse 10 onwards. Why this restoration? There seems to be there's a contradiction or even injustice inside of the divine. He said, no, the retribution principle is wrong, but then I'm going to give you twice as much as before. What the heck is this? Is this a reward or some kind of bad joke or a kind of punishment? Or what is this? Why Job can have twice as much as before, and at the same time, he still has to die. So at the end of the second prosperity, he still has to lose all of it. And as far as philosophy of death is concerned, I don't think Job has any other perspective toward death. Unless we're going to say it's just completely beyond our knowledge that we should stop asking that question. But look, you're going to die. And that existential thought of death would have to enter your mind. That question is not answered. So how do you live this second prosperity? By knowing that the retribution principle is not correct. That is the huge conundrum at the end of Book of Job. And the question that I'd like to pose in the following is one of the most difficult questions in this undergraduate level of philosophy. I usually provide several paper topics for a paper assignment. And this question, almost all students would avoid answering. Maybe like 2% of the class would try to answer that question. And maybe half of them come up with reasonable solution to the problem. It's really easy to argue that the God is unjust. This is the horrible joke on his side. He shouldn't have sided with the devil. That's a really easy way to read the whole story. But if you're going to argue with some finesse and understanding of the intricacy of the arguments, you would have to reconcile this contradiction. So somehow you have to be able to see both God's argument as being true and how the ending is not contradictory to that statement. So that would be one of the most difficult questions that you can answer. And I'm going to pose this at the end of this lecture. So you might be able to try this in your journal. Okay. Final section, questions. First question, why can Job draw a different conclusion from his friends with the same argument about divine transcendence? So I already asked that question. It seems that his friends and God say the same thing about the divine attributes, or Job and his friends agreed that there is a divine transcendence, but they seem to be able to reach different conclusion. And then God at the end of the story says, "You're wrong, friends. Job is right." So how can he do this? Well, what's the differences between these two arguments? Because at the literal level, they seem to mean the same thing. So that's my first question. Second question, what happened to the retribution principle at the end of the book? Do you think the second prosperity in fact contradicts the argument about retribution principle and the book irrationally proves that the retribution principle is in fact right? God gave prosperity to Job because Job was right. So maybe if you really hold your integrity, eventually you'll be able to get these wealth and reputation and family relations again. So this book is really confusing at the end of the story. Third question, how do we understand the double prosperity at the end of a book? Is this a reward? If it is a reward, it is going to prove the retribution principle is right. But if we're going to argue with God the retribution principle is not correct, how should we understand this double prosperity at the end of the story? So that's another very difficult question to answer. In fact, that's the question most students try to avoid answering if I assign this as one of the paper topics. Finally, what happens to death? Do you think the notion of death switches after the conversation with God? Do you think the Job sees death not as a peaceful resolution to this turmoil of life, or does he still maintain that perspective and then go through the second prosperity? There are multiple different answers to this question. So what happens to the notion of death? At the end of the story, Job still has to die. How do we reconcile that notion to this entire story of the book of Job? So these are the questions I'd like you to think about. And that's the end of this story. Okay, that's the end of this lecture. But before closing it, one quick announcement. We're slowly coming out of the different phases of the lockdown in Belgium. And I will have access to a place where we can talk about these ideas online without too many interruptions. Well, hopefully, there aren't many noises, but I'm quite confident that we should be able to do this now. So, first of all, I'm very grateful for your patience with me in going through this class in this format, which is pretty much me talking and you responding in writings. Secondly, I'd like to give more concrete dates. It will be difficult for me to host the class on July 10th. So let's meet via Zoom on 17th, 24th, and 31. Now 31st might be already the study period for exams and you're not supposed to have any classes there. If that's the case, this meeting is not mandatory, but if you're interested in talking about the ending of Camus' La Peste or just want to talk about philosophy in general, I'm available there to talk about ideas. Well, you will get more information about these things from the TA, so we will get back to you with more concrete information about these online meetings. Anyway, that's all for the announcement. Thanks again for listening to this lecture till the end, and I hope the Book of Job is generating a lot of questions in your mind, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you in person / online in the near future. Have a nice weekend, and see you next time.